Good evening. Hello, Rosemary. We like to acknowledge each other in front of everyone.
Stand up, Rose.
She can't. She's covered in chips. We're returning to water, and I see one or two water activists in the room. So poor old Tim Davies. I've never said that about anybody in ECan in my life. But it's really important that we actually talk about what concerns us, and we're at the bottom of the rivers, but one of the things that from a water perspective, this city's got the two most polluted rivers in Canterbury, and we actually have to do something about that, and that's probably for another day. But I see that Tim has picked up my I had to Derek Moot made me withdraw my comment. I'm not very good at. Pam always says if he apologises, don't believe him. But our Canterbury river's increasingly stuffed, and so put your hands together, and Tim's going to tell us what he thinks. So, Tim Davies.
Very brave, Kim.
I've got the rock leaves here.
A beer in one hand. But
Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, and I should complain more to Derek. Derek's an old friend of mine, and he told me about a month or so. He said, I've recommended that you come and speak to the Tuesday Club. And I thought, oh no. But no, it's great to be here, and I'll just do my best to give a bit of an overview, and it is an overview. There's not a lot of detail on individual rivers, except a little bit on the Selwyn, and in fact, yes, I did. I picked up on your increasingly stuff because I thought it was a good terminology that I could use. This picture is from the Selwyn. This was 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. Pretty much 2 years ago today, or maybe a couple of days ago. And this was the water coming down the Selwyn from Cyclone. I can never remember if it was Debbie or the other one. That, after an extreme period of drying, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so this was the wetting front coming, and it was quite interesting to go and see it anyway. But what I wanted to cover is a little bit about how would we measure stuffed? How would we know if it was stuffed if we saw it? And a little bit about flow, water quantity, and then some on water quality, state and trend. And I am just talking about the rivers, not groundwater in particular, but a lot of the systems are groundwater fed, and a little bit about stream ecology as well, because most people when they're talking quality are actually thinking in ecology rather than just water quality, the chemistry. So I'll talk a little bit about these. So start off with Coes Ford. It dominated my life 2 years ago because this is a healthy Coes Ford. I'm sure most of you know Coes Ford on the Waikirikiri, the Selwyn River. This is what it looks like when it's healthy. And this is what it looked like in March 2017. If you can't quite see it, there's a little bit of water just there compared to the same place, and you can see the
What's the timing
vehicle.
of the first shot? And is it a similar time of the year?
That is about this time of year, so that's in the autumn. This was in the middle of summer.
And what year?
I can't remember. I just took it as a nice picture of Coes Ford. I put it as a nice picture, when Coes Ford's looking good. And I put that up because it's important to realise, Coes Ford is a really important place to many people. I grew up not too far away from here. Certainly used to go there myself as a youngster, and I think it is it's an indicative site that we need to think about a lot. But what I would say is this is it in January this year. This is this photo was taken in mid to late January of this year in Coes Ford. It was fantastic. It looked absolutely fantastic. And I'll show you a little bit of data around that. So, I don't need to show that. Just sort of pointing out the Selwyn Waihora catchment, and of course at the bottom of the catchment we've got this groundwater dependent ecosystem, so all of the streams down here are dependent on groundwater to flow. A few of them, like the Selwyn, will flow all the way across the plains for some of the time, but most of the time it's flowing down here dependent on groundwater. So groundwater is a really big driver of what's going on in these systems, and Coes Ford is a good, or the Selwyn, the Waikirikiri at Coes Ford is a good indicator. So here's some data, and I'll try and talk my way through this just so it's not too confusing, and by all means ask questions as we go. This is a groundwater bore, fairly shallow groundwater bore. It's actually out near Leaston. Going back to 1986, so the mid-80s is on the left-hand side, through to very recent. This is 2017 that I was just talking about, when Coes Ford didn't actually technically go dry. It still had a bit of water in it, just didn't flow. So, and this lower one is the lowest flow every year, pretty much on the same scale as on the top there. The lowest flow at Coes Ford in every year. So you can see, hold this, 2017 when it went to zero. And I mean, it's this, to me, this is extremely stark when you look at this and you go, so what did it used to look like? Well, groundwater was staying pretty static all year round, few ups and downs. This is quite shallow groundwater. Coes Ford never dropping below 200 litres a second or something like that. Often up around 500 litres a second as the lowest flow in the year. And then we're reaching this period where you're starting to see these much more dramatic fluctuations. And this is a groundwater dependent system, so we're seeing the same thing in the flows. Excuse me. So there's a direct link. Thanks, Gary. There's a direct link that we can see here, and that's pretty obvious. So what's driving that? And okay, I just wanted to show you, this is a graph of flows at Coes Ford over the sort of the summer period, November through to March, for 3 different years. So 2016-17 is in the blue. That was the year that early in this period here, Coes Ford stopped flowing. And then the following year is in the red, and then this year is in the green. And we've got that data I've only got through till late March. Really quite dramatic differences. And you can see, that when I said Coes Ford, that picture was taken in this period here, when there was a really good flow at Coes Ford. And the reason for this is the amount of recharge that we get. So this is a piece of work that's just been published by one of my colleagues at ECan. And without going into a huge amount of detail, the blue is a kind of an index of aquifer level. So it's like a groundwater level, and it takes lots of wells and it mixes it all up into an index. So 0 is the average. When it's below, when the blue goes below 0, that's when you've got low groundwater. And this is all out in the Coes Ford sort of area. And red is the recharge, by which I mean the rainfall falling on the plains and what manages to get through the soil and infiltrate. So the first thing when you look at it, when I look at this, is that there's obviously a really strong link between the recharge, so essentially the amount of rain, but it's the rain during the winter months, that's when it when the recharge really happens, not during the summer months. So there's this very, very strong link. So groundwater levels are going up when you've got good recharge. The second thing about it though, and it's a bit harder to see, but some stats were done on it, that there's a much closer link back here than there is now. So that the influence of the recharge on the groundwater level is less now than it was in the past. And I mean, no great surprises as to why that would be. It's okay, I thought I had a graph, but it doesn't matter. It's this period from the mid to the late 90s through till now, which has seen the rapid rise in the abstraction, so the groundwater abstraction. So what we're seeing as a result of that is essentially, I'll just get back, this variability. And that variability is putting a lot of stress on the river system so that it's dropping much lower than it has in the past. So in this groundwater fed system, we've got a stressed river because the variability in the groundwater is driven by climate, but on top of that is the abstraction, which is making it much more pronounced. But just bear in mind that, sorry about this. So, what I should say, and I haven't said, is that when we look at groundwater levels and when we look at flows in rivers like the Selwyn, what we do see is that there has been a small long-term decline. But it's quite small. It's not like a sharp drop-off in our groundwater levels. And that's actually linked to less rainfall. So we're getting less rainfall on the plains now than we were 40 years ago. So that there has been a very small decline in our groundwater levels, which is driven by less recharge, less rainfall. I talked about that variability as a stress. That variability is increasing. So abstraction increases the magnitude of that variability, and that's putting more pressure.
Can I just ask, is it abstraction or extraction? I'm just not sure that's
Crikey. Anyone an English major? I talk of abstraction, but it is an extraction of water, but I'm not entirely sure the difference, to be honest. Anybody help me? Abstraction or extraction?
X is taking out of.
Not sure. I use them interchangeably, and maybe I should or shouldn't, I'm not sure.
Taking it out and putting it back on again sounds pretty abstract to me.
We're over here, we're just wondering what the plain English translation of either might be in this
What
context.
do you mean by
Taking water?
I mean taking water out of the groundwater. So using it for irrigation, using it for water supply, using it for whatever you might use that water for. Speaking of which,
That's exemption.
So a quick query, are you saying from that the long-term decline is really caused by, is really caused by climate effects rather than by abstraction or extraction, whatever you want to call them? Is that the conclusion you're drawing from that?
yes, we are. Yep. So the long-term decline, which is a small decline, it's not, I mean, on that graph you probably could hardly see it that I was showing. It is linked to less rainfall. That's what we're seeing overall. So
Seems to be counterintuitive, though, that if you're abstracting a lot of water, you're not suffering a long-term decline in river flows.
So the amount that's being abstracted is being recharged every year, and you can see that it is coming back up again. We're not seeing this gradual decline. And this is in the bores out in the Selwyn area, but we see the same in other bores around Canterbury as well. The other thing that I just point out is I talked about that variability. So the climate change predictions for Canterbury and the Canterbury Plains would be for more variability. So lower rainfall on the plains, more evaporation, that leads to lower recharge overall. So the climate change predictions are for more variabilities, putting more stress. So what that says to me, and I was talking at a conference on Friday about this, is that we need to be thinking about perhaps managing our groundwater in a bit more adaptive way. We tend to do it in a fairly conservative way, using annual allocation, which is based on a long-term average. And maybe we just need to be thinking a bit more about how much recharge there has been in the last couple of winters, and then some further restrictions based on that. And that, I'm pretty sure that if we had that type of approach, the catastrophic collapse in the lower Selwyn that we saw at Coast Ford wouldn't have happened. It still would have been under a lot of stress. It would have gone down because there were two, and it was essentially 2.5 winters of virtually no recharge, but it wouldn't have gone as low as it did, and it would have kept flowing.
Now, if water has been allocated, you're saying there should be some variability on the amount of water that's allocated. How long do farmers have for their allocation of water?
So I'll repeat the question. It's a good question. The question was about how long are consents for at the current. It depends, but the vast majority of them are 25 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a consent review, which is where you call in consents. If you say if a plan came out with an adaptive management approach, then you can have a consent review where they're called in and they get reviewed in line with the plan.
And how often does that happen?
So the question was, how often does that happen?
Has it ever happened? That's the question.
It's happened in the Selwyn Rakai. So there were actual annual allocations put on, because some of the early consents didn't have a total volume. So there was a consent review done. It would have been about 2009, 2010. There was a consent review done in the Selwyn Rakai, this area actually. So it does happen, but I would say it's not done tremendously often.
Who's it done by?
The consenting authority, so in this case, Environment Canterbury. Sorry?
Who applies for that review?
Well, it would be required by Environment Canterbury.
Sorry, question, Tim, just regarding your presentation here today. Are you going to be talking about water quality as opposed to just quantity here?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Look forward to it.
So that's the groundwater-driven systems, but there are other types of river systems, and we generally think in Canterbury of the groundwater-driven systems, hill-fed streams. So that's the Upper Selwyn, for example, or the Ashley, or there's lots of the hill-fed streams, or the large alpine rivers which come from right back on the main divide, like the Rakaia or the Waimakariri or Rangitata and some of those other ones. And if I just really briefly talked about kind of what's happening with our river flow. So what I'm saying is these groundwater-driven systems are under stress. We recognise that, and there have been various things put in place to try and address that.
Just a question, Tim, as a layperson. The groundwater-driven systems surely, ultimately, are also fed by mountain rain. I mean, the large alpine rivers, the initial source of water must overlap, doesn't it?
Yeah, so some of it will come from there. Yep. So the losses of the Waimakariri to Christchurch groundwater feed the Avon River, feed the Styx River, feed the Heathcote River. So yes, they do, but I'm just talking about a kind of a classification in terms of their flow regime. These ones, groundwater-driven systems, generally keep going all through the summer, like the Avon River. It doesn't have extreme highs and lows. Hill-fed systems get really big floods, get a lot of rain in the hills, big flood, and then they'll dwindle away. So they're mostly surface-driven. Highly variable, what the flows are. And this is where, and I know Derek had said to you about the easterly rains, it's in these hill-fed systems that the north and the southeasterly rain really matters. That's where they really get their rainfall from. So, and we have seen less of that type of rain in the last 10 to 20 years, but we still get it. And the hillfed systems, they're pretty well adapted because they are highly variable anyway. They get floods, they go down and things, so they're reasonably well adapted. They are highly variable. And then in terms of the large alpine rivers, well, the main thing that I'd point out there is that the climate change predictions for those rivers are for increased flows, particularly in the winter and the spring. And that's largely due to less snowfall, more rainfall, particularly in the winter. And in fact, increased rainfall, which is to do with more westerlies during that period. Excuse me. So that's kind of an overview of the flow, and I'll go on to water quality now.
Your supporters of the Central Plains Irrigation Scheme thought that it might have an impact on increasing recharge. Is there any evidence to support that at this point in time?
So there are several aspects to Central Plains. The main impact is actually not to do with increased recharge, it's to do with using less deep groundwater. So in the upper plains, up around Darfield and Tiparita and around there, the users switching from deep groundwater to the surface water that's coming from the Rakaia, and therefore not using that groundwater that's then available to flow on through. Have we seen an impact of that? It's hard to tell at the moment, but given that Central Plains, the second scheme, which is the bit that would affect the Selwyn, only came on last September, so it's had one, I think I'm right in saying it, I can't remember my years, but it's had one summer of that, then we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it in the Selwyn area. There's some evidence of it further towards the Rakaia, which is where the first stage was. And certainly in the groundwater bores, there does seem to be some evidence that it is having an impact.
And that may dovetail into water quality.
It may well do, yes. Before I go delve into the data too much, I just wanted to give a little bit about how we think of state and trend, because it's quite important to distinguish between them and understand why we're looking at state and trend. So here I've just made up a data set that looks remarkably like actually quite a few of our data sets. So this is some kind of water quality variable. Let's say it's nitrate, but it doesn't really matter what it is. And this is time, and we're talking about 20 odd years. And what I'm saying is in this imaginary data set, it's gone up and it's come down. And if we start talking about state, yes, when we start talking about state, we're talking about, say, on average the last 1 or 2 years. So when we talk about, what's the state of the groundwater, we're just talking about this relatively short period. But then when we start thinking about trend, we've got to think about what time period is the trend over. So trend becomes a bit more complicated because we can do a 5-year trend, for example. I'm going to show you some data from 5-year trend. We can do 10-year trends, or we can do 20-year trends. And they're telling us very different things. Now, none of them are wrong, it's just they're telling us different things. And that's why we do trend analysis over different time periods. So in these data here, what that's telling us is that in the last 5 years, there's been a decline, an improvement, a decline in the water quality variable, nitrate. Over 10 years, there's been an improvement. But over 20 years, it's got worse. So, that tells us something about what's going on.
It got worse before it got better.
Exactly. So I'm just pointing this out because this is part of the way we think about water quality, because sometimes we're trying to see what's the response to immediate actions versus over the long term. And to be honest, you've got to look at them all together. You can't just choose one or the other. Otherwise, you're starting to pick out what you want to see. So you've got to look at them all together. having said that, most of what I'm going to show you is over the 10-year, and that's because one of the troubles with 5 years is it gets heavily influenced by climate. And if you've had a couple of, let's say, good summers, whichever way you think of good, then it will influence over that short time period. So 10 years gives us some idea of what might be happening, but we must, we can't forget the longer term, and we've got to put them together.
Can I ask, does temperature have a play in this?
Yes, it does. Temperature is a big factor on all sorts of things. Temperature is really important for actually in the stream, so things like dissolved oxygen content, which is really important to fish life.
I live on the Selwyn, I have a batch on the Selwyn, and
Yep.
it can be so warm, it's like a warm bath.
Yeah, so the dissolved oxygen will be really low,
Yeah.
and fish will be struggling to survive, and once you're getting up to those sorts of temperatures. So temperature is important. It's also important for some of the chemical reactions that go on in the stream. So this is kind of what I've talked about anyway, but water quality state is, we're using that to answer questions like, does this water meet the community expectations, whatever those might be? And of course they're different in different places. So is it good enough for a certain value, whether it be swimming or whatever it might be that we're interested in? Water quality trend is used to say, are our interventions making a difference? Is climate change affecting our environment? Some of those sorts of questions. And then we look at the different lengths of trends to answer some of these things about, how long have those interventions been going on, and what might some of the causes be. So, okay, I'll jump straight in with something about water quality state. And before you jump down my throat too much, I'll try and explain what this is and what it does and doesn't show us. So this is looking at water quality state against what's called the National Objectives Framework, comes out of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, for these different things. E. coli, and there's two different measures of E. coli, ammonia and nitrate nitrogen. And this is the data for Canterbury, and you'd look at that and you'd go, well, the state's pretty good. Doesn't look too bad, lots in the A. But there's a big fishhook here, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, that the nitrate nitrogen is based on toxicity for fish, or toxicity for things living in the stream, not just fish. And that has very little to do with drinking water or other ecological states of the river. So this is underplaying the state overall. But it's a classification system for our rivers, and I guess there's a couple of things I'd point out, and it'll come out later on. For example, ammonia, we really don't have a problem in Canterbury with ammonia. One thing that we're thankful for.
We do in the estuary.
In the estuary, yes, but this is freshwater I'm talking about. So one of the reasons that we don't have a problem is because ammonia, one of the major sources, is from sewage treatment works, and for good or the bad, it's not going into our freshwater environment. So ammonia
is showing the
is...
percent of sites that have classified ABC. Is that
Yes,
what
it is. Yes, it is. For the different parameters. So red here is ammonia, this light blue is nitrate.
That's on the key.
So this is across all of Canterbury. It's just different sites. So bearing in mind that this is state, okay, and I talked about that's kind of the last 1 or 2 years, it's not talking about trend.
The number of sites that are classified as A standard.
So if we start looking at water quality trends, now this one does take a bit of talking through, and I'll try and explain it. This is some analysis that was done last year on some of the long-term data for river sites across all of Canterbury. And just because this is the one I can point to easiest, I'll talk through this one, but for a start, these are the different time periods, so 5, 10 and 20 years. Okay, so just so you got your head around that. Each column is a different measure of water quality. So I've already said about, gosh, even I'm struggling to read it. Ammonia, that's ammonia in that column there. This is nitrate. This is dissolved phosphorus, this is total phosphorus. sediment, and E. coli. They're all different measures of water quality. They're all useful for different things. So ammonia is highly toxic for anything living in the stream. You really don't want ammonia in streams. Nitrate is a particular problem for things growing in the streams, the algal growth you get. It has its own toxicity issues, but well before it gets to toxicity levels, it creates problems with algal growth and things in the stream. Phosphorus and nitrogen are both limiting nutrients for any plant growth, whether it be an algae or a plant that we think of, a terrestrial plant. Nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting elements. So these two are sort of plant nutrients. Total phosphorus is actually to do with what's bound to the sediment rather than the dissolved is actually in the water column. So a lot of phosphorus is bound to the sediment, so that's why we look at total phosphorus. Suspended sediment, that's fairly obvious, that's the water, that's actually in the water rather than on the bed. And E. coli being a measure of bacterial contamination. So those are the different measures. What the different parts of these columns are showing is an analysis, in this case over 20 years, of all the sites. So for ammonia in this case, it takes all of the sites and it says how many of these sites are getting worse and how many of them are improving. Okay, and then it does this because, once you start getting into statistics, what do you mean by improving? And what statistical rigor are you putting around that? That we've actually worked on a system that comes out of the climate change, comes out of the IPCC, that says this green here, this sort of lightest, brightest green there, exceptionally likely to be improving over this 20-year time period. So that's the percentage of these 130 odd sites that are exceptionally likely to be improving. And then you sort of go down to extremely likely, very likely, really can't tell, likely to be getting worse, I can't quite remember, getting down to extremely likely to be getting worse. So does that kind of make sense? Do you understand what I'm getting at here? So this is of all of our sites, I'll take your question in a minute, all of our sites, how many of them, or it's a percentage, are getting worse over that time period, how many of them are getting better?
It looks like a lot of cow piss to me.
What I was going to ask is, are the samples taken at the same time of the year? And where are the samples taken from? What part of the river? Rivers, because that can affect the results and when they're taken as well.
So this is the result of 20 years. Yeah, so 20 years of monthly sampling and taken from the same site. So these are fixed sites, goes back to the same site. It's done on a run which doesn't change. So it might not be within a minute of the same time of the day, but certainly within an hour, probably at the same time every time. So we try and eliminate changes like that.
What's the dissolved oxygen? What time of the day is that taken?
Well, it depends which site you're at. Really good question.
Well, you know it changes, right?
Absolutely. So dissolved oxygen changes. That's partly why we haven't done an analysis on dissolved oxygen in this case, because dissolved oxygen, what you really need to know is how much it varies during the day, rather than a single measurement. And what you'd have in that case, because you're on a run, somebody's got to go out and take these samples, and they're doing this run and they're starting in the Waimaka area and they're heading up through the Ashley and up that way. They can't do them all at the same time, but
lunchtime's a waste of time, isn't it? All rivers are fine at lunchtime, they're stable, but in the mornings and evenings they're not. You know that, don't you?
Well, no, I disagree with you, Sam, but
I agree with my joy.
If you are in a highly degraded system, absolutely agree with you that it will fluctuate the dissolved oxygen, which is to do with the photosynthesis going on in the river, and it will change on the time of the day due to what's happened overnight and what's happened during the day. If you're in a like the Waimakariri or the Rakaia, it doesn't actually change very much. So it depends what system you're on.
So I wonder if you should finish the whole talk and then we'll get some questions.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So what when I look at that, what does it tell me? Well, the first thing is that there is this difference between the 20 years, and it's particularly evidence in nitrate compared to the 5 and the 10 years. So what that's saying is that over the 20-year period, a lot more of these sites have got worse than they've got better. But over the short term, they are improving. So overall, what we're seeing is what I think of as like, I'm always a bit reluctant to say this, but I will, the green shoots of recovery. I say that because I was in England in the 90s when one of the chancellors used that term and got much derided. But we are starting to see improvements in water quality. And you can see that because there are more sites that are in this greeny area than in this red area. So that's, just hold that thought, and because I want to go on a little bit further. If you try, I've tried this in different ways, and I don't know if I've done it successfully or not. Cynthia's seen things like this before, where I've tried to combine state and trend. Because what I started to think about was, okay, that's fine, so we're seeing some improvements, that's good. But is it the really bad sites getting better, or is it, the good sites getting worse and things like that? So I've tried to put them together, but as soon as you start saying good and bad, you're putting a value judgment on it. So I've just tried to roughly go, well, in a rough ecological sense, what would be considered good and bad? And it's my call. This has not been published, so it hasn't stood up to any scrutiny, but it gives some idea, and I've tried to be as honest as I can and going, okay, what's when we're talking about nitrate, what's good and what's bad? And of course that depends a little bit on whether you're in a spring-fed system or a hill-fed system. So what this is showing us is that for nitrate, and this is over 10 years, this dark blue are good sites, so reasonably low now, that are getting better. This light blue is bad sites that are really quite high nitrate levels that are getting better, and then the orangey are good ones getting worse, and the red are bad and they're getting worse. So it just sort of breaks down all of those sites, and in this case this is for our spring-fed systems. And I mean, what I showed you before is that you've got more sites getting better, but there are a significant number that are bad and getting worse, which is a problem. It's something that we need to work on. If you look at the hill-fed system, and I should say that grey area is the indeterminate, where you can't, it's not really going up or down. It's we can't determine whether it's improving or getting worse. And then this is our hill-fed systems for nitrogen. Okay, and I'll show you a couple of these. So this is nitrogen. The area where we've seen the most improvement is in phosphorus. And this is dissolved phosphorus. And you can see in our spring-fed systems, where the good getting better and the bad getting better is a significant amount. There's actually none of the good sites getting worse, but there are some bad getting worse. So that's our spring-fed systems. This is our hill-fed systems. And again, these are our, got to get it right, good getting better, bad getting better, and these ones are getting worse. So again, same data, just looking at it in a slightly different way. What do I take out of something like that? Well, you can't ignore these. These are getting worse and they need attention. So, not ducking away from that, but we are seeing improvements. That's one of the things I take out of it. Is it enough? I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing is, why are we seeing more in phosphorus than nitrate? Well, there are several reasons for that. Phosphorus reacts much more quickly to interventions like keeping stock out of waterways, the sort of interventions that are going on where people are riparian, protecting riparian areas. Phosphorus will always respond quicker than nitrogen, which goes through the soil and into the groundwater and out. So nitrogen will take longer to react to interventions. Of course, riparian makes no difference to nitrogen. It's about reducing the amount of nitrogen going in through the farms, and essentially through the farms. So we're seeing a quicker response through phosphorus. This is what we would expect. It's it's hearty, I'll say that. Okay, and then the last one I just wanted to show was E. coli. So that's all of our sites, and you can see on the top left there, that's all of the sites, good, getting better. So less than half are actually getting better. You've got some indeterminate, but there are a significant amount that are getting worse. So again, this is over 10 years. We do have a problem, no doubt about it. But I would just point out, these are the urban sites. This is what Gary was talking about before. Urban sites are terrible. And you've got a huge amount of, this is 29 sites, so it's not as many as overall, which are bad and are getting worse. And then
It was hill stuff.
no, this is urban. I've split it differently this time. I just wanted to illustrate the urban difference. So, we have got a significant problem in the urban areas. We've got a significant problem in the overall Canterbury as well, but urban is a big contributor. So, I sort of said, is it enough? And I said earlier on, I'm not sure how long I'm supposed to talk for, Gary. I'm sorry. I'm probably.
Keep going.
People happy to keep going?
We're still here.
Yeah, that's good. That most people are thinking about ecology as well as water quality. Water quality being the chemistry, essentially. So what do? Well, we measure macroinvertebrates in the stream, and it uses this thing called Macroinvertebrate Community Index, MCI. You may have seen something about that, or QMCI, which is the quantitative Macroinvertebrate Community Index. Essentially what you're doing is you're looking for and it's mostly insect life, but it's not just insects, that are living in the bottom of the stream. And of course they're living there all year round, and they're telling us a lot about the flow, the water quality, the temperature, all of these things. It's an integration of them. And so we go out and you do a kick sample and you analyse how many of the different species. So in this case, the green stonefly is indicative of really good water quality and really good ecology. Any fish people out here will know that. And then you start getting some of these other things, or worms and things that live, and they'll live anywhere. They really don't care about the water quality or the sediment or anything like that. So they get a very low score. So you do this and you count up how many of the different species you can find, and you come up with a score, and it tells us this index, which is kind of the overall stream health, which is giving us an idea of stream ecology. So what happens when we do some trend analysis on MCI, so the stream ecology? Much more depressing. In this case, same type of analysis, so this is MCI, green, highly likely to be improving, highly likely to be getting worse over this 10-year period, most likely to be improving, I can't quite remember the terms. That's indeterminate in there. So basically what we're seeing is at least 50% of the sites are getting worse, or are likely to be getting worse. So you kind of go, okay, so we are seeing some improvements in water quality, but we're not in the stream health. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us a lot, actually, and I think it's worth sharing. Okay, this is my last slide. So, what does it tell us? Well, probably the first thing that it tells us is that what I showed you for the improvements in water quality was just, is there an improvement? Not how steep the line is, just is there an improvement? Improvement normally going that way, down, so water quality going down. So you could be getting an improvement, but it's very gradual and very small, and it's just counted as an improvement. So it may not be ecologically significant. So some of the water quality improvements that we're seeing, our ecological data would suggest are not ecologically significant. And I guess what we're thinking is, yet. That's what we're, that with time, they should reach a point where it does start making a difference on the stream ecology. But there's no doubt, the data tell us quite categorically that a lot of these sites are continuing to see degradation in terms of the invertebrates' health. So, what do we got? There's been degradation from 20 plus years ago. That 20-year data, that shows us that's the truth. That's what we see. We are seeing improvements, but they're probably not, or certainly not all of them, ecologically significant. But we are seeing improvements. So I guess my thing that I normally end this type of talk on is, there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of work going on. We're certainly not there, wherever there is, yet. We are starting to see some improvements, but I would never say that we're finished or that things are great as they are now. Is water quality, are our rivers stuffed? I guess my answer would be no, I don't believe they are stuffed, but they're certainly under a lot of stress, and there's a lot of work that is being done, and I'm not really here to talk about that, but I can, or Cynthia can, about some of the things that are being done to try and reduce the amount of nitrate going in, reduce the E. coli, and other things that are going on around the place, around limit setting, around on-farm interventions, and so on and so forth. But I'll finish there and happy to take questions. Oh, it's hot in here. I don't know if I'm just sweating through fear or...
We're down here in the cool.
Thanks, Tim. Just a question around your water testing. How often do you test those sites? It wasn't clear when you explained it. How often do you test the 100? So it's 130 sites throughout Canterbury?
Yes.
How often do you test?
Monthly.
Monthly?
Yeah.
So if I put a rain gauge out outside my home in Bishopdale and measure the rain once a month, I could get a trend from that?
Yes, you could. It wouldn't necessarily be.
But it would take a really, really long time.
But I mean, what we do know is that water quality is less variable than rainfall. And of course, it depends on what time period you're looking at your trend for. Right. If you're trying to get a weekly trend.
So you've given us a state of water quality for approximately this last 2 years based on 24 samples.
That's right. Yep.
Right, okay, no, yep. That's cool. When it comes to water quality, what variables are tested there? So you gave 6 there, the dissolved nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli, things like that. So do you test anything beyond that?
Yeah, we do. I just haven't necessarily shown all the data for that. And we've already talked about dissolved oxygen. It is, I mean, Sam's right, it's a slightly meaningless thing to compare against because of the time of day and things like that. So there's dissolved oxygen, there's clarity, there's turbidity. I probably won't get them all. There are different forms of nitrogen, so total nitrogen as well as nitrate nitrogen and nitrite nitrogen, and there's ammonia, dissolved phosphorus, total phosphorus, E. coli. I'm probably forgetting, but there are other things. And then the other thing that is done is when the water quality sample is taken, there are assessments done of the fine sediment cover in the stream, so what percentage of fine sediment, and also what the periphyton cover is, which is the periphyton is like the slime that grows naturally on rivers, about the brown algae and diatoms that you get covering rocks.
And what's the range of the order of waterways that you quality test?
Well,
so do you test small tributary streams? Do you test mainly fourth order or larger?
No,
or,
I can see where your question's going, but
representative are they?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever seen an analysis of what order are being sampled regularly, but what I would say is my guess would be, and I can go away and look it up, but it would be that we'd be doing 2 and above. We wouldn't do any first order, because most of the first order are pretty ephemeral, they're not flowing very often and things like that.
And you talked about the kick samples for the MCI. Again, how many sites, how often?
So that's done annually. That's an annual survey.
Of all 130 sites, or different ones?
It's a similar number. They're not quite the same sites, but some of them coincide, some of them don't. But in the same sort of catchments. And I think, from memory, I think it's more like 140 samples. But it's that kind of number.
Thank you.
Yes.
You can shout.
Yeah? Okay. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm really interested in your comment about the ability to implement adaptive management and to call in consents. 20 or so years ago, there was a great trend in 35-year consents, argued on the basis that consents could be called in. It has proved, I believe, a very difficult thing to implement. People have said it's too expensive. I'd really like you to tell me what is stopping consents being called in, and why more consents are not being called in, and what is the average consent these days for water abstraction?
I suspect I can't answer any of those questions. The reason being, I honestly couldn't tell you what the average length is nowadays. I really don't know. But I'm pretty confident in saying that I don't think we're giving out any 33 years. I think 25 is the maximum that we'd be giving now. But I'm not absolutely sure. I don't work in the consents group, and it's not something that I'm that familiar with. Why haven't more consent reviews happened? It is to do with the expense, that it is an expensive process, because in reviewing a consent, there's a thing where you can't derogate the viability of that consent. So in reviewing that consent, you can't make it unusable, that's what the law says, the Resource Management Act says. So therefore you've got to show, and of course, if you're a consent holder, you will fight to say you're making it unusable. And so, there's a lot of work that has to go on for a consent review. I suppose the difficulty for me in answering a question like that is that it's often a political decision. It's not a scientist. I'm a scientist, so I can give you a view of what I've seen has happened, but I can't really answer why we haven't seen more. But it is balanced in around the cost of doing it versus the improvement that you might try and see through it.
Zero under a duly elected board.
Question for you, Tim. 2 questions, actually. One, does ECan monitor or keep a record of infrastructure that's outflowing into river and stream systems around Canterbury? And the second is, does ECan also record and monitor the adjacent land use to rivers? I'm not talking about just riparian buffers, but within a couple hectares, what's the land use, what's the soil profile, what's the biodiversity on that land, and how does that impact on the river systems?
So can I just clarify what you meant when you said infrastructure? Are you talking about I don't know what, stormwater drains or that sort of thing?
I'm thinking of stormwater drains, industrial outflows from production facility, or effluent runoff. Okay, so in the rural area, anything like that requires a discharge consent, and therefore it is monitored where it is, and there will be conditions set around that which will require monitoring by the consent holder, who have to by the consent
holder.
So the consent holder is responsible for self-reporting.
That's right, and it gets audited. Yeah. Okay. Now sometimes that involves us going out and measuring it, but most of the time it's an audit process. So yes, there is a record. Once you're in the urban environment, what we tend to do is, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a global stormwater consent, and that's managed by Christchurch City Council, and they keep the records of where those are. rather than us. In terms of do we monitor the land use immediately, are you talking about around where we take our water samples, or?
Yeah, I'd say just around your sampling.
No, is the short answer. What we do have is an overall Canterbury system where we're looking at land cover. It's always much harder to get land use than land cover, so we're looking at land cover. We're using satellite imagery and things to get regular snapshots of what's going on across Canterbury, but we're not doing any active monitoring of what the immediate land use is. But what's coming in, and it's happening right now, is a lot more farm environment plans are happening, and in fact, anyone without going into too much detail, basically in a farm environment plan, you do have to be mapping out what you're doing on your plan, on your farm, and that's giving an indication of land use, and that information is available.
Is that compared though to the water data you have, or are you comparing the adjacent land data that's impacting on the water?
We haven't done an analysis like that, partly because some of these indicators, like E. coli, would be related to what's really close, but a lot of them, like nitrogen, will be related to a much wider area. So we haven't done an analysis of the type that you're describing, partly because of lack of data, but also because it probably wouldn't tell us an awful lot. At the bigger scale is kind of what we're more interested in, what the land uses are.
Just a general statement and then a question follows, I hope. You must acknowledge there's a big difference between statistical confidence in your data and public confidence, and the two gap is increasing exponentially every day, I would suggest, so to the point where confidence in the Canterbury Water Management Strategy in the general public is plummeting, and the responses through the zone committees, etc., the confidence in those systems is now lower than it has been for a long time. I would suggest your science probably gives some comfort to the dairying industry, but it doesn't give much comfort to anybody else, I don't think. Our experience isn't about averages over global catchments, etc. It's about our experience every day when we dip our toe in the water, or can't, because it's of levels of toxicity in rivers that we've swam in for years, and then last season we couldn't swim in for a whole variety of reasons. That's our experience. It isn't about the science. So how do you reconcile our experience with your science?
In terms of public confidence in the data, I guess I look at it from the point of view of is the scientific rigour in how these data are collected and how they're analysed. And I would say quite emphatically yes. Our sampling systems get reviewed regularly by external people. They're not by ECan staff, by other scientists. The way that it's analysed, we're using well-established techniques. So from a personal point of view, I struggle to accept that there isn't a validity to the data. But I fully accept what you're saying about people's individual experience in rivers, and I can certainly give my own experience in rivers where things have got worse. And I think that's what I was trying to show you is that things have got worse, but there are things going on that are seeing improvements overall. Now that doesn't satisfy an individual in the river that they know well. I fully accept that. I guess it's just, as much as I could show you one story, and I started on Coast Ford because I thought it was a good example of one place, I could have chosen others that told another story. And I guess that's where I try and work at a slightly higher level of aggregating data, because I'm trying to tell the picture overall, but I'm certainly not trying to negate people's own experience, which I fully accept.
Water flows downhill, as we know. Just the sewage analogy is And the biggest point I haven't seen in your presentation is where these sites are, because you can measure them up near the hills and they get flushes and they rush down and all the crap goes down to Lake Forsyth and Lake Ellesmere. Doesn't it end all sort of up there? And while we might have improvements sort of in shorter time frames from flushes, and it's like a sewage system, doesn't it all end up down the bottom? And isn't that where you should be measuring it? So where are these sites? That was my question.
Yeah, okay. So I've spent most of this afternoon preparing this talk, and one of the slides that I left out was exactly what you just asked for. So I apologise for that. I was just trying to think about brevity, and yeah, and I'm really happy to show you where the sites are. I mean, it's an interesting criticism that we in regional councils have had over several years, which is that we're cherry picking in terms of where we're monitoring. I absolutely refute that. In fact, well, I don't refute it, because in fact we do cherry pick, but actually we cherry pick the other way, because most of our monitoring sites are where we know there is a problem. They are not, it's not a random distribution across Canterbury. It's certainly not a distribution that favours hill country and high country. We have, I would say, probably out of those 130, maybe 3 or 4 that you would consider, you know, right up in the high country. The vast majority are on the Canterbury Plains or in the hill country. So I'm really happy, and I'll send that map around that shows where the sites are. But if anything, our sites are biased, and this has actually been a problem in setting up a national network. Regional council sites are biased towards the area where the water quality is worst, because they've been put there because we know there's an issue.
Mike, Sam, everybody in this room has a memory of a river. They have their favourite rivers. Is that right?
Yeah.
And we all have memories. And for me, where I've lived for 30 years on the Haranui, I've got the Waitoa, the Waipara, the Waikaria River, I've got the Waiau River and the Haranui River. These are beautiful rivers. I watched them all go one by one. Christmas time, I took my daughter down to the Haranui to swim way above any of the developments. There's only 3 or 4 dairy farms above where we were swimming. It's almost up at the gorge, where you can't really touch the river. And there was the cyanobacteria mat starting at the edge of the river. And we had to leave. I mean, ECan stole Christmas from hundreds of people down by Balmoral Forest this year and the year before. When I hear you saying the rivers are improving, can you understand I have a gut-wrenching feeling against you, and I think this is insulting in a small way? Okay, but that's natural, and I think a lot of people here would feel that. I have not seen one river improve, except for some of the spring-fed rivers around Lake Wahura. The question I want to ask you is this: the 0.8 milligrams per litre level that ANZAC say is the tipping point in river ecology health. Steve Lowndes says that there's no scientific basis for that level. Can you reply to that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I've just replied first of all to the statement you made before, because I absolutely agree. I mean, Sam, we were talking just before about I grew up just beside the Horsell River and used to play around in it as you did, and you know, it saddens me to
with different women.
You know, it saddens me as well. I'm with most people in that respect. In terms of the 0.8, okay, this is so the ANZAC guidelines are not based on thresholds of damage. They're based on averages overall that you see around in the environment. So that's the ANZAC level. Now, there has been some work that Russell Death has done around the impact of nitrogen on macroinvertebrates, and that has suggested a threshold of about 0.8, which is, so the 0.8 figure gets used in different ways. Those data have never been scientifically peer reviewed, and Russell himself would say
that same level is used in China and the States and Australia. So has it been peer reviewed here or what?
No. It hasn't been used as a threshold for where damage occurs, where we're seeing a tailing off. When you look at the data for macroinvertebrate index against nitrogen, there's a huge scatter. And you can't just pinpoint 0.8. So that's what Steve was referring to, that there hasn't been a proper analysis or a clear thing as to where that should be. But that doesn't mean that, what we're talking about here is, when I showed those staked, and I said that nitrogen, it's a bit of a red herring because that's based on toxicity. We do know that when you get into nitrate concentrations in rivers above, and it is around 0.8, and but it depends on the river, you start getting problems. You start getting more periphyton growth, you start getting algal growth if the river's slow and things like that. So it definitely affects the ecosystem. It doesn't mean that 0.8 is this magic figure, that below that you're great, because in fact, below 0.8 you can also have problems.
What is your level?
Well, it depends on the river, and this is the real difficulty. It depends absolutely on the flow regime, how often it floods, what the river is like overall, and equally what you want to use that river for.
Okay, well look, I tell you what, I'll just finish with this one thing. You said the river quality is improving in most rivers. Well, there seems to be an improvement in quality, but the macro invertebrates aren't. But the macro invertebrate index is a way of measuring the health of the river. Isn't that slightly oxymoronic?
No, that's exactly, you've summarised exactly what my message was, Sam, so I thank you for that. My message was we are seeing improvements in water quality, but it's not enough because we still aren't seeing those improvements in the macroinvertebrate health and in the stream ecology. So, it's the green shoots is what I'm suggesting, is that we are starting to see improvements, but it's not enough. We've got more to go.
Thank you.
Quick question. I love data and analysis and so on. Do you intend to increase your data monitoring points and frequency and automate them?
So I'm going to come down because it's really hot up here. Okay, so automation, that's an interesting one. And certainly we are starting to do more of that. So particularly, but what we know is that the technology is there, and it has been for about the last probably 5 years around nitrate. But some of these other things like phosphorus, E. coli, you can't measure continuously off a continuous thing. It has to be done in a laboratory. Dissolved oxygen you can, turbidity you can, nitrate you now can. And we're starting to put more in, but they're expensive, $20,000 for a nitrate sensor and things like that. So, it takes a while before you start getting to use these. So we are improving it, and it tells us a lot more about what's happening in the river. So, Sam, earlier we were talking about dissolved oxygen. It tells you a hell of a lot more to see what happens over a 24-hour period than a single sample. So it does tell us a lot more. We are improving. In terms of the number of sites, look, we'd love to. We'd love to. How much more are you prepared to pay in your rates? That's the debate and the question that goes on in the regional council.
Get cheaper managers.
Doesn't get published.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and it's really enlightening. Reflecting back on your comments about different time frames, and also reflecting on what Sam had to say, I suspect that the experience of a lot of people in this room isn't the 20-year time scale, it's the 40, 50, 60, and maybe even 70-year time scale. So I just wonder whether you'd like to comment on what the trend has been over the longer period.
Yeah, good question. The reason that we've stopped at 20 is not Machiavellian. It's purely that we don't have a lot of sites that go well beyond 20, so that an analysis like I showed you becomes a bit meaningless when you're on very few sites. But we do have some that certainly would have 30, maybe 40 years at the maximum. They show very similar things for like that 20-year type of trend where things have got worse. No doubt about that.
Good point to finish on. I found this absolutely fascinating, and I think it's just great that we've got somebody with this quality of commitment and ethics at the Regional Council. And I think you'll all join with me in saying thank you, Tim, and I'm sure your conversation